Hello, my friends. Welcome to your hidden story. My world was one of ink and lead and the relentless pressure of the screw. I was born a Boston boy, and by the age of 14, I was apprentice of Mr. Eads at his print shop on Queen Street. The year was 1765, and my days were a rhythm of setting type, locking it into chase, and pulling the heavy bar of the press until my shoulders ached. The smell of damp paper and bitter ink was the scent of my youth. Boston then was a proud city, a jewel of the British crown. In the New World, we were Englishmen. And we were proud of it. We had celebrated the victory over the French just 2 years before a victory our colonial militias had helped to win. We toasted the king and saw ourselves as partners in the greatest empire the world had ever known. But the partnership was beginning to feel like a master and servant relationship. The war had been expensive, and Parliament in London decided that we the colonists should help pay for it. This seemed fair enough to many at first, until we saw how they planned to do it. The first sign of the trouble to come was the Sugar Act, but it was a Stamp Act that truly lit the fuse at MR. Eads read the news from a London paper with a grim look on his face. A tax, he explained to me, his voice low and tight, on every single piece of printed paper. Newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even the paper for my own apprenticeship contract would require a royal stamp, a stamp for which we had to pay a tax. But it was not just a money. IT was a principle at MR. Eads slammed his hand on the composing stone, making the lead type rattle. They tax us, and we have no voice in their parliament and no representation. This is not the right of an Englishman. This is the mark of a slave. His words echoed what was being said in the taverns, on the docks, and in the halls of assembly. The print shop became a nerve center of the growing resistance. Men would come in at all hours, their faces grim, whispering in the back room. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Men like Samuel Adams, a fiery orator whose passion could stir a crowd to a frenzy, and John Hancock, the wealthy merchant whose signature would one day become a symbol of defiance itself. I would sweep the floors and refill the ink, but I would listen. I learned new words like tyranny and despotism and liberty. That some of the city began to simmer. On a hot August morning, we awoke to find an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the appointed stamp master, hanging from a great elm tree in the South End. It was a grotesque, dull, but the message was clear. The crowd that gathered was not just a mob. They were my neighbors, the shoemaker, the baker, the shipwright. They were Boston. That night they tore down the building Oliver had constructed to be a stamp office and marched to his home, breaking his windows. The IT was frightening, but it was also electrifying. IT felt as if the people were finding their voice, and it was a roar. The great elm became known as the Liberty Tree, a rallying point for the Sons of Liberty. The pressure was immense, and Andrew Oliver resigned. But the anger did not subside. But a few nights later, the mob turned its fury on the mansion of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Manseen as a sympathizer with the Crown's policies that I witnessed the aftermath. His magnificent home was gutted, his priceless library of books thrown into the street, his fine furniture smashed to pieces. MR. Eads shook his head when he saw it. This, he said, is not the way. This is chaos, not liberty. But the message was sent, and one would dare to enforce the Stamp Act in Boston. When the stamp paper finally arrived in the harbor, no one would touch IT. IT sat on the ships unwanted and unusable. The resistance spread to every colony. Finally, after months of protest and a boycott of British goods, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The city erupted in celebration. Bells rang, cannons fired, and the Liberty Tree was decorated with lanterns. IT seen that our protests had been heard, that we had won. But on the very same day that they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed another law, the declaratory ACT. IT was a short law, but its meaning was a slap in the face. IT declared that Parliament had the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. They had taken away one tax, but had asserted their absolute power to impose any tax they wished in the future. The celebration died in our throats to MR. Eads was right. The fight was not over, it had only just begun. The next few years were a slow burn. Parliament tried again with the Townshend Act's new taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Again, we organized boycotts. Women held spinning bees to make homespun cloth, so we wouldn't have to buy British textiles. IT was a quiet and determined resistance. But this time, London's response was different. They sent soldiers. In the autumn of 1768, 2 regiments of British regulars, the Redcoats, as we called them, marched into Boston. Their bright red uniforms were a jarring sight, a declaration of occupation. They set up camp on the Boston Common, the public land where our cattle grazed. Their sentries stood on every corner, their bayonets glistening. The city changed. IT became a tense and angry place. The soldiers were poorly paid and took odd jobs for extra money, taking work away from local laborers. Fights were common. The air was thick with insults and resentment. The soldiers called us Yankees, and we had far worse names to them. I was a young man, now no longer a boy. I felt the anger in my own heart. I saw the arrogance in the soldiers, walked the contempt in their eyes. This was our city, and they were an occupying force. The tension grew tighter and tighter until on a cold, snowy evening in March of 1770, it finally snapped. IT started with an argument, a boy insulting a British officer. A sentry struck the boy with his musket, but a crowd gathered. Church bells began to ring, not for a fire, but as in, alarmed, I ran out of the shop into the chaos. People were pouring into the streets, shouting, throwing snowballs and chunks of ice at the lone sentry standing guard at the custom house. He was terrified. He called for help, and a small detachment of soldiers led by a Captain Preston came to his aid. They formed a line, their muskets loaded, their bayonets fixed. The crowd pressing, daring them to fire. The air was a storm of insults and threats. Someone threw a club, hitting one of the soldiers. He stumbled, and his musket discharged. Then in the confusion, the other soldiers fired a ragged, chaotic volley into the crowd. The smoke cleared and 5 men lay dead or dying in the snow. Blood stained the pristine white ground. The city erupted in a collective scream of horror and outrage. The Boston Massacre, as it became known, was not a battle. It was a street brawl that ended in death. But it changed everything. I saw my neighbor Crispus, a Tuxan man of mixed race, who had worked on the docks lying lifeless, his blood pooling around. Him. The abstract argument about rights and taxes had become a matter of life and death written in blood on the frozen streets of my home. The soldiers who had been sent to keep order had killed the very people they were supposed to protect. We were no longer just angry subjects. We were beginning to feel like a different people entirely, an American people. In the days following the massacre, a strange and heavy silence fell over Boston. IT was a silence of shock and of mourning. The 5 men were laid to rest, and thousands followed the procession, their faces a mixture of sorrow and cold fury. The city was united in its grief and its outrage. Governor Hutchinson, seeing the mood of the people and fearing a full-scale insurrection, had no choice but to remove the troops from the city center. They were sent to Castle William, an island fortress in the harbor. Their departure felt like a victory, like we had taken our city back. But the question of justice remained. Captain Preston and his soldiers were arrested and charged with murder. The whole world was watching. London believed we were a lawless mob, and they expected a quick-show trial and a hanging. But what happened next surprised everyone, including me. The soldiers needed a lawyer, and no one would defend them, and no one except John Adams. He was Sam Adams's cousin, a staunch patriot, and one of the most respected lawyers in Boston. When I heard the news, I was confused and angry. How could a patriot defend the men who had shot our neighbors down in the street? I asked Mr. Eads as I cleaned a block of type. He looked up from his work, his spectacles perched on his nose. Because Samuel, he said, we are a people of laws, not a mob. If these men cannot get a fair trial in Boston, then everything we say about liberty and justice is a lie. And so I watched as the trial unfolded. John Adams argued. Brilliantly, he did not defend the soldiers' presence in Boston, but he argued that in the chaos and fear that night, they had acted in self-defense against a threatening crowd. IT was an unpopular argument, but was based on evidence and reason. I, in the end, the jury, which was made up of our own people, acquitted Captain Preston, and most of his men, .2 soldiers, were found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter, branded on the thumb, and released. Justice under the law had been served. IT was a powerful statement. We had proven we were not the hysterical rabble that London imagines to be. In the wake of the trial, a fragile calm settled. Parliament, seeking to ease tensions, repealed all the Townsend duties, except one, the tax on tea. It was a symbolic gesture, a stubborn reminder that they still claimed the right to tax us. For a couple of years, life almost felt normal again. The ships came and went. Merchants traded. People went about their business, but the calm was deceptive. The wound had not healed, it had only scabbed over. The tax on tea was a constant irritant, and the print shop, Mr. Eads, was busier than ever. Sam Adams and his allies had established committees of correspondence, a network to share news and coordinate resistance among the towns of Massachusetts and with the other colonies. Our press was constantly at work printing pamphlets, letters, and circulars that carried the spark of liberty from one town to the next. I was no longer just an apprentice sweeping floors. I was a compositor, a man who arranged the lead letters into words and sentences that would be read by thousands. I felt the power in. I was setting the type of the arguments that were shaping our world. Then in 1773 came the news that would shatter the quiet once and for all. The British East India Company, a massive corporation that was vital to the British economy, was on the verge of bankruptcy. Tito Save It Parliament passed the TACT. IT was a clever and insidious LAW. IT was not a new tax. Instead, it gave the company a monopoly, allowing it to ship its tea directly to the colonies and sell at a price so low that it would be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that everyone drank, even with the hated Townsend duty included MR. Eads read the act and threw it down on his desk in disgust. It's a trick, he said, a bribe. They think we are fools. They think we will sell our birthright, our principles, for a cheap cup of tea. If we pay the duty on this tea, we are admitting that Parliament has the right to tax us. We are agreeing to our own enslavement. The committees of correspondence went to work. Letters flew up and down the coast that I in Philadelphia. In New York, the people convinced the tea agents to resign, and the ships were sent back to England with their cargo untouched. But in Boston, Governor Hutchinson was determined to enforce the law. His own sons were the designated tea agents. He was resolved that the tea would be unloaded and the tax would be paid. In late November, the first of the tea ships to Dartmouth sailed into Boston Harbor. According to the law, if the duty was not paid within 20 days, the ship's cargo would be seized by customs officials, unloaded, and sold at auction. The clock had started ticking. The city held its breath. Mass meetings were held at the Old South Meeting House. Thousands of people packed inside and out. They demanded that the ship's owner send the tea back to England, but Governor Hutchinson refused to issue the pass that would allow the ship to leave the harbor. He had trapped us. The deadline was December 17th. On the evening of December 16th, the final meeting was held. The air in the Old South was electric with tension. Samuel Adams stood up, his voice clear and steady. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. He declared IT was a signal. As his words echoed to the hall, a great war whoop was heard from the doorway. IT was answered by shouts from the crowd. Men disguised as Mohawk Indians, their faces covered in soot and red paint, brandishing hatchets, emerged from the crowd and headed for the wharf. I ran with my heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment of decision. The night was cold and clear, the moon bright in the sky. The disguised men, perhaps 100, and 50 of them were orderly and disciplined. They boarded the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. There was no looting, no violence, no drunken chaos. There was only the quiet, resolute sound of hatchets breaking open the heavy wooden chests, and the splash after splash as 342 chests of tea were hoisted up and dumped into the cold, dark waters of Boston Harbor. IT took them nearly 3 hours. When they were done, the tide was thick with floating tea. Lee's IT was an act of breathtaking defiance. We had not just resisted the law, we had destroyed the king's property. We had thrown his tea back in his face. Standing there on the wharf, watching the last of the tea sink into the harbor, I felt a shiver of both fear and exhilaration. I knew that we had crossed a line. There would be no turning back. The time for petitions and boycotts was over. King George III and his parliament would not ignore this. Retribution would be swift and severe. The Boston Tea Party was not a party at all. Instead, the chilling news of the king's wrath at Parliament's response to our Tea Party was not a negotiation. It was a punishment designed to crush our spirit and make an example of us to the other colonies. They called them coercive acts. We called them the intolerable acts. The first and most devastating was the Boston Port Act. On June 1st, the port of Boston was to be closed, completely sealed off by a naval blockade. NO ships in, no ships out. Our city, our lifeblood, our connection to the world was to be strangled. The act was a death sentence for a city of merchants and sailors and craftsmen. But it did not crush US. IT united us. The other colonies did not abandon us as London had hoped. They rallied to our side. Wagons loaded with flour and fish and rice began to arrive from Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and even the far-off Carolinas. The cause of Boston, they declared, was the cause of America. The second act was the Massachusetts government, ACT. IT stripped us of our right to self-government. Our colonial charter was revoked. Our elected council was abolished and replaced by a council appointed by the king. Town meetings, the very bedrock of our democracy, were forbidden without the governor's permission. General Thomas Gage, the commander of all British forces in North America, was appointed as the new military governor. The city was placed under martial law. The third was the Administration of Justice Act, which we call the Murder Act. IT stated that any British official accused of a capital crime in Massachusetts could be sent to England for trial. We all knew what that meant. They could act with impunity, kill our citizens, and face no justice from a jury of our peers. And finally, there was a new quartering act which allowed the governor to house his soldiers in any occupied building, from taverns to private homes if necessary. The city transformed. IT became an armed camp. Thousands of redcoats poured in. They were everywhere, their scarlet uniforms a constant glaring reminder of our subjugation. Tents sprang up on the Boston Common. They drilled in our squares their drums and fifes, a mocking soundtrack to our silent fury. The once bustling harbor fell eerily quiet, its docks empty, its warehouses locked. The economy ground to a halt. Men I had known my whole life stood idle on street corners, their hands in their pockets, their faces etched with worry and anger. The print shop became more dangerous and more important than ever. We were printing sedition.mr. Eads had to be careful. We published articles under pseudonyms and smuggled our papers out of the city to be distributed throughout the colonies. That I felt a constant knot of fear in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a printer. I was a soldier in a war of ideas. To IN September delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies for Georgia was still hesitant met in Philadelphia. They called it the First Continental Congress. They voiced their support for Massachusetts and called for a complete boycott of all British goods. They sent a petition to the king, but they also advised the colonies to begin arming and training their militias. The air grew heavy with the scent of war. Throughout the autumn and winter, we began to prepare. Outside the city, in the towns of Concord and Worcester, and 100 others, a militia drilled openly. They called themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. We began to stockpile weapons and gunpowder, hiding them in barns and basements. General Gage knew what was happening. His spies were everywhere. He knew about the stockpiles in Concord. He also knew that two of our most prominent leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, had taken refuge there. As the snows melted in spring of 1775, began Gage decided he had to act. He had to crush the rebellion before it could grow any stronger. On the evening of April 18th, the city was alive with whispers. There were movements among the troops. Gage was trying to be secretive, but in a city where every window had eyes, it was impossible. The Patriots had a network of watchers and messengers. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the leaders of our movement, dispatched 2 riders to warn the countryside, a tanner named William Dawes and a silversmith named Paul Revere. Their mission was to ride to Lexington and Concord to warn Adams and Hancock and to alert the militia that the regulars were coming out. I was part of a small group tasked with signaling their route. We had arranged a simple code .1 lantern in the steeple of the old North Church if the British were marching out by land across to Boston. Neck .2 if they were crossing the Charles River by boat. From a hidden vantage point, we watched the British troops muster on the common. They were heading for the water. .2 lantern. I watched as a friend of Revere's climbed the dark steeple. For a moment, 2 points of light shone out over the city, a silent message flying through the darkness. Then they were gone. Revere was already across the river, his horse waiting. He rode into the night, a messenger of revolution. The British troops, about 700 of them, were ferried across the river. They began their long march in the dead of night. Their goal was secrecy, but the countryside was already awake. The alarm was spreading like wildfire. From town to town, church bells rang and signal guns fired. The Minutemen were grabbing their muskets and running to their muster points. As the sun began to rise on the morning of April 19th, the British column reached the town of Lexington. On the village green, about 70 of our militia had gathered. They were mostly farmers and mechanics drawn up in 2 ragged lines. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. They did not intend to start a war. They intended to make a silent protest, a show of defiance. The British commander, Major Pitcairn, rode forward. "Disperse, ye rebels, disperse," he shouted. Captain John Parker, our commander, told his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let begin here." The 2 forces stood facing each other in the hazy morning light. Then a shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for sure who fired. It was a single shot that broke the terrible tension. The British regulars responded with a volley and then another. Our men were not prepared for a battle. They scattered and ran. When the smoke cleared, 8 of our militia lay dead on the green, and 10 more were wounded. The British cheered and fired a victory volley. They had met the rebels, and the rebels had run. They reformed their lines and marched on towards Concord, confident that their mission would be an easy one, but the war had begun. The blood spilled on Lexington Green had changed everything. The regulars had fired on British citizens, and now the entire countryside was rising against them. The day was far from over. The British column marched into Concord feeling confident and superior. They split up the search for the hidden military supplies. But they were too late. The warnings had given us enough time to move the vast majority of the cannons and gunpowder to other towns. They found and destroyed a few supplies, throwing barrels of flour into the mill pond and burning a pile of wooden cannon. Carriages, as the smoke rose from the center of town, the militia, who had been gathering on the hills outside Concord, saw it and feared the regulars were burning their homes. This was the final provocation. Our commander, Colonel Barrett, made the decision. He would march his men to defend the town. The chosen point of confrontation was the North Bridge, which was being held by a contingent of about 100 redcoats. Our force had now grown to over 400 men from Concord, Acton, and other nearby towns. We marched down the hill towards the bridge that as we advanced, the British fired a few warning shots, and then a full volley. This time we were ready. Captain Isaac Davis of the Acton militia was struck and killed, instantly becoming the first American officer to die in the war. Our commander, Major Butchert, shouted, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." And we did. Our volley was disciplined and deadly. The redcoats were stunned. They had expected us to run as the men at Lexington had. Instead, we stood and fought. They broke ranks and fled in a panic retreat back toward the main force in town. We had held the bridge. IT was a small skirmish, but its significance was immense. We had met the king's professional soldiers in open combat and forced them to retreat. We had fired what the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the shot heard round the world. General Gage's mission was now a failure. He had not found the weapons, he had not captured the Patriot leaders, and his troops had met armed resistance. The only thing left to do was to get his 700 men back to the safety of Boston, a journey of some 16 miles through a countryside that was now a hornet's nest. The march back was a nightmare for the British. The road from Concord to Boston became a 20-mile-long gauntlet of death. The alarm had spread everywhere. Militiamen from every town and village converged on the road. We didn't fight in organized lines like a European army. We fought as we had learned from fighting the Indians from behind stone walls and trees and barns. We were a swarm of angry farmers and townsfolk. I was among them that I had made my way out of Boston in the chaos and joined a group from the town of Brookline. I was not a soldier, I was a printer. But that day, I had a musket in my hands. I remember the feeling of hiding behind a stone wall, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the column of redcoats march past. They were so exposed, so vulnerable. We would fire a volley into their flank, and then run across the fields to get ahead of them and fire again. The British were disciplined, but they were not trained for this kind of fighting. They were marching targets. Panic began to set in. Their formations broke as they ran from one side of the road to the other, trying to find cover. Their ammunition was running low. They were exhausted and terrified. Only the arrival of a relief column of 1,000 men and 2 cannons sent out from Boston saved the entire expedition from being annihilated. Under protection of the reinforcements, the battered survivors limped back towards the city. By the time they reached the safety of Charlestown at nightfall, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. We had lost less than 100. IT was a stunning victory for our side. The day of April 19th, 1775 was over. IT had begun with a show of force by the British Empire, and it had ended with their armies shattered and humiliated, hunted back to their base by the very people they had meant to intimidate. The news of Lexington and Concord spread like a brush fire throughout the colonies. IT was a spark that ignited the American Revolution. In the days that followed, an amazing thing happened. Militia units from all over New England began to march towards Boston. From Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Hampshire, they came by the thousands. There were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants dropping their tools and picking up their muskets that I watched as the spontaneous citizen army began to surround the city of Boston. They blocked the land access at Boston Neck and occupied the hills and towns encircling the city. In a matter of days, the British Army, under General Gage, was trapped. They controlled the city and the harbor, but they were besieged by a raw and angry army of some 15,000 colonists. I found a place with the Massachusetts troops that MY printing days were over for now. We had no uniforms, no formal command structure, and very little discipline. But we had a cause. We had seen our neighbors killed and our homes threatened. We were fighting for our own land. The siege of Boston had begun. Life in the siege camp was chaotic and disorganized. We were still a collection of town militias, not a unified army. But we were learning. Veteran soldiers from the French and Indian War began to drill us. And from the South came word that the Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. They were taking charge of the war effort. They adopted our motley group of militias as their own, creating the Continental Army. And to lead this new army, they made a choice that would shape the destiny of our nation. They appointed a Virginia planter, a man who had commanded troops in the last war, a man of imposing height and quiet dignity. His name was George Washington. His arrival in Cambridge in early July was a momentous occasion. He rode in on a magnificent horse, his presence alone commanding respect. He was not a New Englander. He was a Virginian. His leadership made our struggle a truly American one, not just a Massachusetts squabble. But our situation was perilous. We were an untrained army with very little gunpowder, facing the most powerful military force on earth. The British still held Boston, and in June they had been reinforced with fresh troops and 3 of their top generals, Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne. They were not going to sit idly and be starved out. They were planning to break out of the city. We learned of their plan to seize the hills in Charlestown, which overlooked Boston and its harbor. To preempt them on the night of June 16th, our commanders sent a force of about 1,200 men to fortify Bunker Hill. Under the cover of darkness, we marched silently into Charlestown, but our commanders made a crucial decision. Instead of the larger Bunker Hill, they chose to fortify the smaller Breed's Hill, which was closer to Boston and more exposed. It was a daring and provocative move. I was part of that digging party. All night long we worked with shovels and picks, constructing a redoubt, a crude earthen fort on the top of the hill. By wide dawn we had built a surprisingly strong position. When the sun rose, the British looked out from Boston and were stunned. They're on a hill where nothing had been the night. Before was a fortress manned by rebels daring them to attack. The British generals were both furious and astonished. The existence of our fort on Breed's Hill was a direct challenge to their control of the city. They knew they had to dislodge us immediately. General Gage and his commanders had a choice. They could have surrounded the peninsula with their warships, cutting off our retreat and slowly starving us out. This was a sensible military option. But they were proud men, and their army's reputation had been stung by the retreat from Concord. They saw us as an undisciplined rabble of peasant army. They chose to teach us a lesson in the face of European military power. They would not outsmart us, they would crush us with a full frontal assault. Across the water in Boston, I could see the preparations. The city was a hive of activity. Barges began to ferry thousands of redcoats across the Charles River to the base of the peninsula. They formed up in perfect lines, their red coats and white trousers, a brilliant spectacle against the green grass. Their bayonets glittered in the midday sun on our side of the hill. There was a strange mix of fear and determination. We were a collection of farmers and artisans, not soldiers. Many of us had never seen a real battle before, but we had worked all night, and we were ready to defend the ground we had claimed. Our commander, Colonel William Prescott, walked along our lines, his presence steady and reassuring. He knew we were low on ammunition. He gave us the order that would become the stuff of legend: don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. He needed every shot to count. From my position inside the redoubt, I watched the first wave of British regulars begin their slow, deliberate advance up the hill. They marched as if on a parade ground, their lines perfectly dressed. It was a terrifying and beautiful sight. The silence on our side was deafening, but we waited. The redcoats got closer and closer. I could see the details of their uniforms, the brass buttons, the cross belts. I could see their faces determined and professional. My hands were slick with sweat on my musket. Still we waited. The order came, a ripple of shouts along the line: fire. Our volley was a single crashing roar. The effect was devastating. The front rank of the British line simply disappeared as if swallowed by the earth. Whole sections of their perfect lines crumpled. The regulars who were still standing wavered in shock. They had never faced firepower like this. They were trained to fire a volley and then charge with the bayonet. They were not prepared for the relentless accuracy of men defending their own homes. The first wave broke and fell back in disarray down the hill, leaving the green slope dotted with the bright red coats of their dead and wounded. We had done it. We had stopped them. A ragged cheer went up from our lines. We had held our ground. But we knew they would be back. They were formed at the bottom of the hill, their officers shouting and pushing them back into formation. And they came again. The second assault was a repeat of the first. Again, they marched slowly up the hill into the face of our guns. Again, we waited until they were almost on top of us. Again, our volley tore their lines to shreds, and again they broke and fled. The smoke from the muskets was now so thick that it was hard to see. The smell of gunpowder and sweat and fear hung heavy in the air. The British had also set fire to the town of Charlestown at the base of the hill to clear out any snipers. The black smoke from the burning town billowed into the sky, creating a hellish backdrop to the battle. We had repelled them twice, but our situation was desperate. Our ammunition was almost gone. We were exhausted, dehydrated, and many of us were down to our last few rounds. We broke open the few artillery cartridges we had and passed out the powder and balls. Some men had nothing left but rocks to throw. The British knew this. Their third assault was different. They came on again, but this time they did not stop to fire. They came on with a bayonet. They swarmed over our earthen walls. We had very few bayonets ourselves. The fighting became brutal, and hand to hand, we fought with the butts of our muskets, with our fists, with our bare hands. I remember a redcoat lunging at me, his face a mask of fury, his bayonet aimed at my chest. The man next to me, a blacksmith from my town, swung his musket like a club and brought the soldier down. The battle was lost. We had no choice but to retreat. We fell back over the top of the hill and down the other side, running for the neck of land that connected the peninsula to the mainland. The British now controlled the hill, but the cost to them was staggering. They had taken the ground, but they had suffered over 1,000 casualties, more than a third of the troops involved in the assault. Their officer corps was decimated. IT was a victory that felt like a defeat. We had lost far fewer men, and we had proven something to the British, and more importantly to ourselves, that we had proven that we would not run. We had proven that a citizen army could stand up to the best professional soldiers in the world. As one British general famously said of the victory, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known, was a moral victory for U.S. IT galvanized the colonies. IT showed that this was not just a rebellion of a few hotheads in Boston, but a real war that would be fought with blood and iron. When the news of the battle reached London, it caused a sensation. The idea of a quick and easy suppression of the rebellion was shattered. And when the news reached George Washington, who was on his way to take command of the army, he asked only one question: did the militia stand their ground? When he was told that they had, he replied, "The liberties of the country are safe." He knew that the spirit shown on that hill was the spirit that could forge a new nation. The siege of Boston continued to the rest of the year. IT became a stalemate. The British were bottled up in the city, suffering from shortages of food and supplies. We held the surrounding countryside, but we lacked the heavy artillery needed to dislodge them. IT was a long and difficult winter. But Washington was a patient and determined commander, and he was about to get the tools he needed to finish the job. While our army shivered in the camps around Boston, a remarkable expedition was underway. Washington's greatest problem was his lack of heavy artillery. He needed cannons to threaten the British fleet in the harbor and to bombard their positions in the city. The cannons he needed were hundreds of miles away at Fort Ticonderoga, a British fort on Lake Champlain in New York that had been captured in a surprise attack earlier in the year by Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys. But getting them from Ticonderoga to Boston in the dead of winter seemed impossible. The task fell to a young officer, a former bookseller from Boston, named Henry Knox. He was a man of immense size and even greater determination. He proposed a plan that was audacious to the point of being foolhardy. He would lead a team to Ticonderoga, dismantle the cannons, and transport them over 300 miles of frozen lakes, icy rivers, and the snow-covered Berkshire Mountains. Washington gave him the go, dash ahead. IT was an epic undertaking. Knox and his men used sleds pulled by teams of oxen to haul the 59 cannons, which weighed a total of 60 tons. They built bridges over rivers that were not frozen solid and cut new paths through the dense forest. The journey took nearly 3 months of backbreaking labor and brutal winter conditions that I saw them when they finally arrived in Cambridge at the end of January 1776. It was an incredible sight. This noble train of artillery, as Knox called it, was a testament to American ingenuity and sheer grit. Washington now had the key to unlock Boston. His plan was as bold as Knox's journeyed. He would repeat the tactic we had used at Breed's Hill, but on a larger scale, under the cover of darkness. He would fortify the Dorchester Heights, a series of hills to the south of Boston that commanded both the city and the harbor. It was an even more dominant position than the Charlestown Peninsula. On the night of March 4th, the operation began. To distract the British, Washington ordered a massive artillery barrage on the city from our positions in Cambridge and Roxbury. The sound was deafening. The British returned. Fire in the whole area was lit up by the flashes of cannon fire. Under the cover of this thunderous noise, several thousand of our men began to work on Dorchester Heights. This time we were better prepared. We used prefabricated frames and bales of hay to speed up the construction of the fortifications. All night long, hundreds of carts moved back and forth, bringing tools and supplies. By morning, the impossible had happened again. The British awoke to see a line of formidable new forts bristling with cannons on the hills overlooking them. General Howe, the British commander now in charge, was in an untenable position. His fleet was a sitting duck for our new guns. He knew he had to attack, as he had at Bunker Hill. But this time our position was even stronger, and a snowstorm delayed his plans. Faced with the prospect of another bloodbath and with his fleet at risk, Howe made the only decision he could. He chose to evacuate. He struck a deal with Washington. If the Americans would not bombard the city while his army departed, he would not burn Boston to ground. Washington agreed. For over a week the British prepared for their departure, and on March 17th, 1776, St. Patrick's Day, the last of the British ships sailed out of Boston Harbor. They took with them not only the entire army, but also over 1,000 loyalist colonists who had remained loyal to the king and now had to abandon their homes. The siege of Boston was over. We had won. We marched into a city that had been the crucible of the Revolution. It was a joyful and emotional homecoming. We had liberated our own capital. The city had been under occupation for years and was a shadow of its former self. But it was free. The victory was a huge boost to American morale. We had forced the mighty British Army to abandon one of its most important cities. But we knew this was not the end of the war. It was only the end of the beginning. The British had not been defeated, they had simply relocated. We expected them to return with a much larger force and to strike at the heart of the colonies. And at the same time, a different kind of revolution was taking place, not with cannons, but with words that in January that year, a pamphlet had appeared that would have an impact as great as any battle. It was called Common Sense. It was written by an Englishman named Thomas Paine, who had only recently arrived in America. But he understood the American spirit perfectly. His pamphlet was unlike anything we had read before. It was not a dry legal argument addressed to educated gentlemen. It was written in plain, forceful language that anyone could understand, and its argument was explosive. Paine attacked the very idea of monarchy and hereditary rule. He called King George III a royal brute. He argued that it was absurd for a continent to be governed by an island. He said that reconciliation with Britain was a foolish dream. There was only one path forward, he declared: independence. Common sense was a phenomenon that It spread to the colonies like wildfire. We printed in our shops. It was read aloud in taverns and on street corners. It sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months. It crystallized the feelings that have been growing in many of us for years. It broke the last psychological tie to the mother country. It gave us the intellectual courage to consider a future not as reformed British subjects, but as free and independent Americans. As the British fleet sailed away from Boston, and the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was moving towards this momentous step. The delegates from the various colonies were debating the great question. In June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a formal resolution that these united colonies are, and a right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a declaration to the world explaining the reasons for our separation. The task of writing the first draft fell to a young delegate from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. For 17 days in a rented room in Philadelphia, he worked with a quill pen by candlelight. He was not trying to invent new ideas. He was trying to express the mind of the American people. He drew upon the ideas of the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke and the Virginia Declaration of Rights written by George Mason. But he expressed these ideas in a language of soaring and unforgettable beauty. He began with a preamble that would change the world. He wrote that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He went on to list the grievances we had against the king, proving that our actions were not taken lightly. That on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted for Independence Point. 2 days later, on July 4th, after making some changes to Jefferson's draft, they formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The news spread from Philadelphia, carried by riders on horseback. When it reached us, it was greeted with joyful celebrations. I and New York soldiers tore down a statue of King George. I in Philadelphia. They rang the bell in the State House steeple, a bell that would become known as the Liberty Bell. We had done it. We had declared ourselves a new nation. But a declaration is just words on a piece of paper. Now we had to win on the battlefield, and we all knew that the full and terrible wrath of the British Empire was about to descend upon us. The real war was about to begin. No sooner had the celebrations over the declaration died down than the terrible reality of our situation became clear. Just as we had predicted, the British returned. But they did not return to Boston. They came to New York, and they came a force that staggered the imagination. IT was the largest expeditionary force the British Empire had ever assembled. Over 400 ships and 32,000 soldiers, a massive professional army of British regulars and German mercenaries known as Hessians gathered in New York Harbor. Their goal was to seize New York City, control the Hudson River, and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, thereby splitting the rebellion in two. Washington had anticipated this move. He had marched the Continental Army from Boston to New York to defend the city. But our army was a shadow of the force descending upon us. We had perhaps 19,000 men, poorly trained, ill-equipped, and with no navy to support us. The city of New York, located on the island of Manhattan, was a strategic nightmare to defend. The British, with their total naval supremacy, could land their troops wherever they wished. The first blow fell in late August on Long Island. General Howe landed a large force, and in a brilliantly executed maneuver, he outflanked our positions. The Battle of Long Island was a disaster for us. Our raw troops were completely overwhelmed. Some units fought bravely, but many panicked and ran. We suffered over 1,000 casualties, and many more were captured. IT was a humiliating defeat. Only a desperate nighttime evacuation saved the remainder of our army on Long Island. Under the cover of a thick fog, Washington managed to ferry his troops across the East River to the safety of Manhattan. IT was a masterful escape, but it was a retreat. The loss of New York City now seemed inevitable. The British landed on Manhattan, and we were forced to fall back again and again. A series of skirmishes followed, but the trend was always the same. We would fight briefly and then retreat. Morale plummeted. The army began to dissolve. The militiamen whose short-term enlistments were up simply went home. They had families to feed and farms to tend. They had not signed up to be part of a losing army. In the autumn of 1776, we were pushed out of New York entirely and chased across New Jersey. IT was a retreat that felt endless. IT was a time of utter despair. I remember marching to the mud and the freezing rain, our shoes worn through our uniforms in tatters. We were hungry and cold and defeated. The local people of New Jersey, who had cheered us as liberators, now looked at us with fear and pity. Many of them took the oath of allegiance to the king, believing the revolution was over. The dream of independence that had seemed so bright and glorious in July was now a flickering candle in a storm. IT was during this dark and desperate retreat that Thomas Paine once again gave us the words we needed to hear. He was marching with the army, and he wrote his next pamphlet, The American Crisis, on a drumhead by the light of a campfire. Washington ordered it to be read to the tattered remnants of our army. I will never forget hearing those words for the first time, my comrades, and I huddled together for warmth. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Those words did not fill our bellies or warm our feet, but they did rekindle the fire in our hearts. They reminded us of what we were fighting for, and they steeled our resolve to stand it. Now it'd be why December our army had been pushed all the way across New Jersey. We crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, seizing every boat we could find to prevent the British from following. The British Army under General Howe was content to let us go. He established a series of outposts in New Jersey and settled his army into comfortable winter quarters, believing the war was all but won. Our army was on the verge of collapse. We were down to only a few thousand men, and the enlistments of most of them were due to expire at the end of the year. Washington knew he had to do something desperate. He had to stake everything on one bold stroke. He planned a surprise attack that on Christmas night, 1776, in the midst of a fierce winter storm, he would lead his army back across the frozen Delaware River and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The plan was almost insane. The weather was horrendous, a blizzard of snow and sleet. The river was choked with large chunks of ice that I remember the crossing. It was a night of pure misery. The boats were dangerously overloaded. Men used the butts of their muskets to push the ice floes away. We were soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. The journey was supposed to take a few hours, but it took all night. We were hours behind schedule. Washington was told that the men's muskets were too wet to fire. His reply was grim and determined: use the bayonets. We finally reached the New Jersey side and began the 9-mile march to Trenton. The roads were slick with ice. The men's shoes fell apart, and they left bloody footprints in the snow point. 2 men froze to death on the march. But we kept going. We arrived at Trenton just after dawn. The Hessians, who had been up late celebrating Christmas, were completely unprepared. They stumbled out of their barracks into the driving snow to find an army descending upon them. The battle was short and decisive. Surrounded and confused, the Hessians put up a brief fight, but they were soon overwhelmed. Within an hour, we had captured nearly 1,000 prisoners and suffered only a handful of casualties ourselves. The victory at Trenton was a thunderclap. IT was a stunning reversal of fortune. IT electrified the country and breathed new life into the cause of independence. A few days later, Washington did again. Evading a larger British force sent to trap him, he launched another surprise attack, this time on the British garrison at Princeton. Again, we were victorious. These 2 small battles in the dead of winter changed the entire psychological dynamic of the war. The British were forced to abandon most of their outposts in New Jersey. Our army did not dissolve. Inspired by the victories, thousands of soldiers re-enlisted and new recruits began to arrive. We had proven that we were not defeated. We had proven that the American cause was still very much alive. We spent the rest of that winter encamped at Morristown, New Jersey. The hardships were immense, but we had a newfound sense of hope. We had survived the darkest hour. But the war was far from over. The British still held New York. And in the spring of 1777, they would launch a new grand strategy to end the rebellion once and for all. IT would be a campaign that would lead to a great defeat, a winter of unimaginable suffering, and ultimately to the turning point of the entire war. In the spring of 1777, the British put a new grand strategy into motion. IT was an ambitious plan to sever New England from the rest of the colonies. The plan had 2 main parts. A large army under General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada down the Lake Champlain and Hudson River corridor. A second smaller force would move east from Lake Ontario. And General Howe's main army in New York City was expected to march north to rendezvous with Burgoyne at Albany. If successful, the plan would give the British complete control of the Hudson River and isolate the heart of the rebellion in New England. At first, the plan seemed to be working perfectly for the British. Burgoyne's army easily captured Fort Ticonderoga, a major blow to American morale. He then began his long march south through the dense wilderness of upstate New York. Meanwhile, General Howe, instead of marching north to meet Burgoyne, made a baffling decision. He decided to pursue his own objective, the capture of the American capital, Philadelphia. He put his army on ships, sailed down the coast, and landed at the head of the Chesapeake Bay. Washington was forced to move his army south to defend Philadelphia. He knew he could not allow the capital to fall without a fight. On September 11th, 1777, our 2 armies met at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. Washington chose a strong defensive position, but once again Howe executed a brilliant flanking maneuver similar to the one he had used at Long Island. Our army was defeated We were forced to retreat, and the British marched into Philadelphia unopposed. The Continental Congress fled the city. It was another major defeat for us. We had lost our largest city and our capital. But Washington was not demoralized. He was a fighter. That a few weeks later, he launched a daring surprise attack on a British garrison at Germantown just outside Philadelphia. The plan was complex, and in the thick morning fog our columns became confused and fired on each other. The attack failed, so as winter approached our situation looked bleak. The British held both New York and Philadelphia, and Burgoyne's army was deep in our territory in the north. But up north, Burgoyne's campaign, which had started so well, was beginning to fall apart. His march was much slower and more difficult than he had anticipated. Our Northern Army, led by General Horatio Gates, was growing stronger every day as militiamen from New York and New England flocked to join it. And Burgoyne's supply lines were stretched thin and constantly harassed by our troops. I ended a series of battles near a town called Saratoga. In the autumn of 1777, the American forces under Gates and the brilliant battlefield commander Benedict Arnold decisively defeated Burgoyne's army on October 17th. 1777, General Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire army of some 6,000 men. The Battle of Saratoga was a staggering victory for U.S. It was a turning point in the entire war. The news of the surrender of a whole British army shocked the world. It proved that the Americans could win a major conventional battle. And most importantly, it convinced the Kingdom of France to formally enter the war as our ally. The French had been secretly providing us with aid for some time, but they had been hesitant to commit fully. Saratoga gave them the confidence they needed. The alliance with France meant everything. It meant money, weapon supplies, and most critically, it meant the French Navy. The war for independence had now become a global conflict, and Great Britain would have to fight on multiple fronts. But the news of Saratoga and the French alliance was of little comfort to me and the rest of the main Continental Army. Under Washington, as the victorious Northern Army settled into comfortable quarters, we marched to our own winter encampment. It was a place whose name will become synonymous with suffering and perseverance. Valley Forge. Valley Forge was not a battle. It was a test of human endurance. It was about 20 miles outside of British-occupied Philadelphia. Our army of about 12,000 men arrived there in December 1777 week and demoralized after the defeats at Brandywine and Germantown. We were poorly fed, inadequately clothed, and utterly exhausted. There were no existing barracks. We had to build our own crude log huts with our bare hands. The winter was harsh and our supply system completely broke down. Food was scarce. Many days the only thing to eat was fire cake, a disgusting paste of flour and water cooked over a fire. Blankets were a luxury. Shoes were non-existent. I remember seeing the bloody footprints in the snow left by men whose feet were wrapped in nothing but rags. Sickness was a far greater enemy than the British. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia swept to the crowded and unsanitary huts. It was a slow motion. Catastrophe. Over 2,000 men died that winter from disease and exposure. Without a single shot being fired, It was a time of absolute misery. And I saw men cry from hunger and the cold. I saw strong men I had known for years waste away to skin and bones. Morale hit rock bottom. Many men deserted. It felt like the army and the revolution itself were dissolving in the mud and snow of that terrible place. And yet we endured. What held us together was the sheer force of will of one man, George. Washington, he stayed with his men, sharing their hardships. He relentlessly lobbied Congress for more supplies. His unwavering presence and determination were the glue that kept the army from completely falling apart. And in the midst of this frozen hell, something transformative happened. A foreign volunteer arrived in our camp. He was a Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He was a professional soldier from the most disciplined army in Europe. He was appalled by the state of our army, but he saw the potential in our men. He took on the task of training us. He did not speak English, so he shouted his commands in German and French, which were then translated. He started with a single company of 100 men, and he drilled them relentlessly. He taught them the fundamentals of military discipline, how to stand at attention, how to march in formation, how to use the bayonet effectively. He was a character with a volcanic temper, but his passion for soldiering was infectious. Soon the entire army was engaged in his training program, and a miracle began to happen. Out of the starved and ragged mob, a professional army began to emerge. We learned to be soldiers We developed a sense of pride and discipline. When spring finally arrived and we marched out of Valley Forge, we were a different army. We were no longer a collection of militias. We were a trained and unified fighting force ready to meet the British on equal terms. The ordeal of Valley Forge had not broken U.S. IT had forged us into an army of steel. The British, meanwhile, had a new commander, Sir Henry Clinton. With France now in the war, he decided that Philadelphia was no longer a valuable position. He chose to abandon the city and consolidate his forces in New York. In June of 1778, his army began the long march across New Jersey. Washington saw an opportunity to strike. Our newly trained army intercepted the British at Monmouth Courthouse. The battle that followed was one of the longest of the war fought on a day of scorching heat. IT was a confused and chaotic affair, but it proved the value of von Steuben's training. Our men stood toe-to-toe with the British regulars in a conventional European-style battle, but we held our own. The battle ended in a tactical draw, but for us, it was a strategic victory. We had met the main British army in the field, and they had not been able to defeat us. After Monmouth, the war in the north settled into a stalemate. The British remained secure in New York City, and Washington's army kept them bottled up there. The focus of the war was about to shift. The British, seeing they could not win a decisive victory in the north, would turn their attention to the south. They believed there was a large loyalist population there that would rise up and help them crush the rebellion. The war was entering a new and brutal phase, a bitter civil war that would be fought in the swamps and forests of the Carolinas and Virginia. And it would be in the South that the final act of this long and bloody drama would be played out. The British strategy to conquer the South began with a series of successes. In late 1778, they captured the port city of Savannah, Georgia. And in 1780, they achieved their greatest victory of the entire war. After a long siege, they captured Charleston, South Carolina, and with it an entire American army of over 5,000 yen. IT was a devastating blow, a disaster on the scale of Saratoga, but this time for our side. With Georgia and South Carolina now largely under their control, the British commander. In the South, Lord Cornwallis began to move into North Carolina. He was confident that he could pacify the entire region. But the Southern campaign did not go as the British had planned. They had expected a groundswell of loyal support, but it never fully materialized. Instead, they found themselves in a hostile country, fighting a very different kind of war. The war in the South was a nasty and personal affair. IT was a guerrilla war, a civil war that pitted neighbor against neighbor. Patriot militia. Leaders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and Thomas, some of the Gamecock, waged a relentless campaign of harassment against the British. They would strike from the swamps and forests, attacking British supply lines and outposts, and then disappear back into the wilderness. They may not have won great battles, but they kept the spirit of resistance alive and made it impossible for the British to ever truly control the countryside. The Continental Army also regrouped after a terrible defeat. At the Battle of Camden, the command of our Southern Army was given to a new General Nathaniel Greene. He was a brilliant strategist, a man Washington trusted completely. Greene knew he could not defeat Cornwallis's main army in a single decisive battle, so he adopted a clever strategy of attrition. He would divide his smaller force and use it to lure the British into a series of costly chases and engagements. His plan was to wear Cornwallis down to win. By not losing, that Greene strategy worked perfectly. He fought a series of battles at places like Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. Even when we technically lost battles, we inflicted such heavy casualties on the British that their victories were hollow. After the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis's army was so battered that he had to abandon his campaign in North Carolina and retreat to the coast to rest and refit. This was the moment when the final act of the war began to fall into place. Cornwallis made a fateful decision. Instead of staying in the Carolinas, he decided to march his army north into Virginia. He believed that Virginia was the key to the war, and that if he could conquer the rebellion in the South would collapse. He eventually consolidated his forces and established a deep water port and naval base at a small tobacco port on a peninsula. The place was called Yorktown. Meanwhile, General Washington was encamped with the main Continental Army outside New York, still watching the main British Army under Sir Henry Clinton. But a new and powerful element had entered the equation. A large French army under the command of General Rochambeau had landed in Rhode Island. And more importantly, a powerful French fleet under the command of Admiral de Grasse was sailing from the West Indies with orders to cooperate with Washington for a major operation. Washington's first plan was to use this combined force to launch a massive attack on the British in New York. But then he received a critical piece of intelligence. He learned that Cornwallis had entrenched his army at Yorktown, and he learned that Admiral de Grasse's fleet was sailing not for New York, but for the Chesapeake Bay. Washington instantly saw the opportunity of a lifetime. It was a trap. If the French fleet could control the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, it could cut Cornwallis off from the sea, preventing his escape or reinforcement. And if the combined American and French armies could march south and besiege him by land, Cornwallis would be caught. It was a daring and complex plan that required perfect timing and coordination, and it had to be done in absolute secrecy. If Clinton in New York realized what was happening, he could either attack Washington's army as it marched south or send reinforcements to Cornwallis. In late August 1781, Washington made his move, leaving a small force behind to make the British think he was still preparing an attack on New York. He began to march the bulk of the American and French armies south. At It was an incredible logistical feat, a march of over 400 miles. I was part of that march. For weeks we did not know where we were going. There were rumors and whispers, but the destination was a closely guarded secret. There was a new energy in the army, a sense of purpose and anticipation. Every step we took felt historic. At the beginning of September, we received the news we had been praying for. Admiral de Grasse's fleet had arrived at the Chesapeake and had engaged the British fleet, sent to relieve Cornwallis. The French had won a decisive naval victory. They now controlled the sea. The trap was sprung. When we arrived at Yorktown in late September, the combined Franco-American army numbered some 17,000 men, more than double the size of Cornwallis's force. We surrounded the British positions and began to dig siege lines. The process was methodical and relentless. Under the direction of French engineers, we dug a series of parallel trenches, each one closer to the British. Lines we built redoubts and batteries for our heavy siege cannons. Henry Knox, the man who had brought the guns to Boston, was now in charge of a massive artillery park of American and French guns. The bombardment began on October 9th. It was the most intense artillery bombardment of the entire war. Day and night our cannons and mortars pounded the British positions. The ground shook constantly. The sky was filled with the fiery trails of shells. It was a relentless and terrifying spectacle that I watched as our cannonballs smashed into the British defenses, reducing their fortifications to rubble. There was nowhere for them to hide. Their position was hopeless. The key to their outer defenses were two small detached forts known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10. On the night of October 14th, we launched a surprise assault to capture them. The French were assigned to attack Redoubt 9, and we Americans were given Redoubt 10 to ensure speed and surprise. Were ordered to advance with unloaded muskets and to rely solely on the bayonet. It was a terrifying prospect to run into a hail of gunfire with no ability to shoot back. But we did it. We stormed the redoubt, and after a short and brutal fight, we captured it. The French were also successful. With the loss of these two redoubts, the British inner lines were now completely exposed to our artillery at point-blank range. Cornwallis knew the end had come. He made one desperate attempt to escape, ferrying some of his troops across a river, but a sudden storm scattered his boats. There was no hope left on the morning of October 17th, exactly 4 years to the day after the British surrender. At Saratoga, a lone British drummer appeared on the ramparts beating a parley to a British officer, followed waving a white handkerchief. The guns fell silent. The siege of Yorktown was over. 2 days later, on October 19th, 1781, the formal surrender took place. It was a day I will never forget as long as I live. The British Army marched out from their defenses, their uniforms immaculate, their faces a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. They marched between two long lines of silent soldiers, the French on one side and us the Americans on the other. Their band were ordered to play a British tune. They chose a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," and in that moment it truly had. The ragged citizen army that had been forged in the fires of Lexington and Valley Forge had, with the help of our French allies, defeated the most powerful empire on earth. The surrender at Yorktown was a final decisive blow. It did not officially end the war, but it broke the will of the British government to continue it. The war for American independence was finally won. The news of Yorktown spread to the States, creating a wave of jubilant celebration. But for us in the Army, the end did not come so quickly. The months after surrender were a strange and uncertain time. The war was effectively over, but the peace had not yet been signed. We remained encamped watching the last of the British forces in New York and Charleston. IT was a period of great anxiety. The Army was restless and discontented. We had not been paid for months, sometimes for years. The government, under the weak Articles of Confederation, was bankrupt and powerless. There were dark whispers of mutiny of the Army, refusing to lay down its arms until its grievances were addressed. There was even talk of marching on the Congress and establishing a military dictatorship with Washington as our king. IT was a perilous moment of time when our hard-won revolution could have unraveled. But Washington put an end to IT at INA meeting with his officers. He appealed not to their interests, but to their honor. He spoke of the cause they had fought for and the republic they had created. A key moment. He put on a new pair of spectacles, remarking, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." In that simple human gesture, any thought of rebellion melted away. His officers were shamed by their own doubts and reaffirmed their loyalty to civilian government. Washington's leadership had saved the republic once again, not with a sword, but with his character. Finally, in September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The war was officially over. The Army was disbanded. I received my discharge papers, and what? Little back pay the government could muster. And then I walked home. IT was a strange feeling. For 8 years, the Army had been my life, my family, my world. Now it was gone. I was no longer a soldier. I was a citizen of a new nation, a nation I had helped to create. Returning to my old life was not easy. The world had changed, and so had I. The print shop in Boston was still there, but my old master, Mr. Eads, was gone. I was a man now with lines on my face and a quietness in my soul that had not been there. Before it, I had seen too much. But I also felt a deep sense of pride. We had done it. We had faced down an empire and created something new in a world of government that derived its power from the consent of the governed. The years that followed were as challenging as the war itself. The new nation struggled. The Articles of Confederation were failing. The states bickered and quarreled. The economy was in ruins. There was a moment when it seemed the whole grand experiment might fall apart due to our own weakness and division. But once again, the leaders of our revolution stepped forward. In 1787, they met in Philadelphia to forge a new government. They created the Constitution, a document of profound wisdom that has guided our nation ever since. And they chose the one man that all Americans trusted to be our first president, George Washington. I lived to be an old man. I saw the nation grow and change in ways I could never have imagined. I saw the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next. I saw new states join the Union. I saw the beginnings of a new American identity forged not just in war, but in the shared work of building a country. Sometimes my grandchildren would ask me what it was like. They would ask about the battles and the heroes, and I would tell them the stories of Lexington and Trenton and Yorktown. But I would also try to tell them the things that were harder to explain, that I would try to tell them what it felt like to be hungry and cold and afraid, but to keep fighting. Because you believed in something, I would try to tell them about the quiet courage of ordinary men, farmers and shopkeepers and printers who risked everything for an idea. And I would tell them that the revolution was not just a war. IT was the beginning of a conversation, an argument about the meaning of liberty and equality that we are still having to this day. The American Revolution was a story of my life, that I was born a subject of a king, and I died a free citizen of a republic. M.Y. hands which had once set the type for revolutionary pamphlets were now frail and spotted with age. But I had played my small part. I had been a witness to the birth of my country, and as I sat in the twilight of my years, I was filled with a sense of peace. The world had indeed been turned upside down, and we had been the ones to do it. The story was now theirs to continue.